Okay, hello everyone. We are playing catch up again. So we're roughly 5 or 6 days behind in terms of these online lectures, but this is the one that you need to pay attention to for the first real quiz. Okay, so we're gonna finish chapter 2, and that's all the content for quiz number 2. Let's start by talking about King Arthur and Robin Hood. These are fictional characters. They're not real, but they have become the most famous people. I guess Harry Potter is up there now too. But Arthur, probably the first person people think of as a representative British character, and then Robin Hood after that, and maybe Harry Potter comes third. Robin Hood, we talked about Arthur already, so that's not really relevant to this test because we already talked about him. He actually, the person he's based on probably lived in the 5th century, but the stories that were written about him were written during the 12th century. As I said, in French, and Richard the Lionheart, who is in the textbook, you can read about him, and he went on crusade, and he had a sword. He fashioned himself after Arthur. He considered himself real life embodiment of Arthur. So Robin Hood, actually, the story of Robin Hood starts about 100 years later, but when we tell the story, we push Robin Hood back in time so that Richard the Lionheart is on crusade, and King John, who I said, the Magna Carta, I told you that's a very significant event where King John, he was formerly Prince John, and while his brother was on crusade, his brother was the king. So for the 10 years or so that, well, Richard was basically, his entire life, he was fighting in France or he was fighting in the Middle East. For the duration of his brother's reign as king, he's Prince John, but his brother dies in a sort of freak accident. Crossbow bolt hits him, gets infected. I think it's the shoulder, not the leg. But Richard dies, and then King John takes over. Prince John becomes King John, and he's one of 2 kings who the British have never repeated his name because he was such a bad king. He was so unpopular. He was so unpopular that the barons got together and they made him sign a document next to a place called Runnymede. They sit him down and make him sign this charter, this document that limits his power. So he's not allowed to do whatever he wants anymore, just because he says that God has chosen him as the top of the chain of being, the king above everybody else. So they limit the unlawfulness of the king, and ever afterwards the Magna Carta, even though in its own time it didn't have a big effect, it was referred to as the beginning of the process of becoming a democratic country and limiting the power of the monarch. Okay, so Magna Carta is very important. You have to remember Richard considers himself sort of the Arthur of his own age, and that Robin Hood is a hero that fights against the tyranny of, he robs from the rich and gives to the poor, as we say, and fights against the power of the monarchy. Now, we talked about the 14th century in lecture. There's 3 important things you have to remember. It's a very up and down sort of period. Before the 14th century starts, there is a very famous king named Edward I. He succeeds to after John, there ends up being sort of a up and down. Richard's a famous good king, warrior king, and then you got John, who's a bad king, and then you end up with Edward the First, who sort of conquers all of England and re-establishes the monarchy as a very powerful, institution. So we got Edward the First, Edward the Second, and Edward the Third, all in a row. Edward the First is a very effective king. Edward the Second is very unpopular and ends up being dethroned for his son. So I call them the Edwards. It's 1, 2, 3. So we'll do the Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3. The first one is good, the second one is bad, the third one is good. But none of them get a lot of attention these days because they were warrior kings. They caused a lot of damage. They made war with France, they made war with Scotland, they made war with Wales. They fought a lot. That was their strong point. They were tall, handsome. Edward the First is called Longshanks, which means long legs. And my son's name is Edward, and he's named after Edward the First. I sometimes think maybe that wasn't the best choice of kings to, but anyway, his name Edward it's English. It's a really English name. Ed means wealth, and ward means guardian. So, as far as I guess luck is concerned, it's a lucky name. Edward means guardian of wealth. So this is a very popular name. Edmund is the same sort of name. They go back to the Anglo-Saxon period, pre-Norman conquest. William is definitely a French name. It's a sort of anglicized version of Guillaume, but Edward is a traditional Anglo-Saxon name. So the Edwards, the second one tries to lead the armies, but is not a very good military leader. He actually prefers art and the entertainment of the court, but he's not a very effective leader, and that makes, after having Edward the First, who was a very effective king, he also went on crusade like Richard did, came back, took control of the country. Everybody was confident that he could fight a war against anybody. Scotland, Wales, the French, doesn't matter. So the period of the Edwards is leading up to the famine. Edward II is the king during the famine, so there's a disaster. It's not his fault. Presidents or leaders or kings get blamed for things when things go badly. So 7 years of bad weather. The Scots, they lose the war against the Scots. Scotland remains independent. This is the setting for Braveheart. Some of those events in Braveheart are accurate and some of them are not. But anyway, the English end up losing when they should, based on paper, with more money and more soldiers and better equipment, they should win, but they lose. And during the famine, there's a lot of raids, so the English are very upset about the government, and that ends up, eventually they end up killing Edward II in favor of his son. But what his son does is his son, Edward III, he does several things that cause big problems. One of them is he starts a war with France that doesn't finish for 100, it's called the 100 Years' War, but it's actually 115 years or something like that. And it's not a continuous war the way that modern wars are, where it's battle after battle, and some battles last a month. These are like series of battles that everybody links together. It's really kind of 3 periods of fighting, which cover about 115 years. But after the whole thing was done and England lost in 1453, this sort of at at the end, the French take back all the territory, kick the English out of France completely, and gunpowder is starting to be used. Cannons start to appear. So there's a change in technology, and these knights, which Edward III is a knight. He's a traditional sword and armor, shield, horse kind of person. By the time 1453 rolls around and Henry VI is the King of England, now archers, long range, weapons are becoming more effective, and knights are disappearing because they're so expensive, and they don't win battles, and they don't win wars anymore. As a consequence of this, the king becomes unpopular, and there's a conflict, a civil war, effectively, that goes right until the end of the 15th century. These two dates are possible dates for the end of the medieval period. I call this lecture Medieval Times because there's a Medieval Times tournament, dinner and tournament in Toronto. They have them all over the place. They're all over the place. And if you want to go to one in Chicago or New York or, I don't know, Cincinnati, they probably have it too. It's just they simulate what it's like to be a person who's living at this time. It's all entertainment. It's all fun. You sit down and you eat food with your fingers. There's like big piece of chicken and I think there was potatoes, but there wouldn't be potatoes yet because potatoes come from the New World and they didn't exist in the medieval period. But a big piece of bread and some meat on a bone probably, and you just eat it with your hands, and you probably just have a spoon for soup. Anyway, you're supposed to cheer for your knight. There's usually 4 knights. They fight each other. It's a simulation of what used to sort of happen in a medieval tournament. Most of the stuff is very romanticized, just like Arthur. It's not realistic. These are all things that happened, and we've looked back at them and sort of changed them to suit our idea of what it was like. Reality of medieval period, I told you already, people were very religious. The whole town revolved around the church. There's no real doctors. There's no there is medicine. There are people who mix things from the forest, herbs and plants that can have some, give you some relief. But generally, people's health would fail around my age. 43 would be that sort of critical point where you would either keep living until you're 60 or health problems would finish you. So whether you were a king or not was relevant. If you were rich, you probably have a better environment, eat better food, and have a better, cleaner environment. However, lots of wealthy people died suddenly or gradually, and pain was probably something. There was no Tylenol. You just have to imagine whenever you had a toothache, or in my case, for the last week and a half, I've had an ear infection. They would just call it an earache or a stomach ache or a backache. We still say these things. Ache means like a sort of ongoing pain that you'd have to live with day after day. And there wasn't very much relief for that. So there's a lot of, people who were in pain. It didn't matter which country you were in. England is no different. So like I said, let's go back to the 14th century because that's the most important thing that we talked about. the Great Famine happened because the weather changed, and there was very bad weather, and less food, and there was an overpopulation because the weather was so good for hundreds of years. That made the arrival of the Black Death on the fleas that were on rats on ships and carts even more deadly than it would have been, because most of the people in middle age had grown up with less nutrition and an unhealthy environment because of the famine anyway. I told you also that there was a virus that spread in the livestock, so sheep and cattle also got sick and died. So there was less meat, less protein, less food overall, and so the Black Death wiped out an entire generation of people, making people who are very religious react, in different ways. We talked about that too. Chaucer was born pretty much the year he was born, I think, as far as we know. He was a pretty famous person in his own lifetime, so it's pretty safe to say that in the 1340s he was born. Wycliffe was a little bit older than him, but Chaucer was one of the lucky babies who survived all the other problems plus the Black Death. He easily could have gotten sick and died when he was a kid, but he survived the Black Death. He survived to adulthood, and he wrote Canterbury Tales. He's considered sort of the father of English literature, mostly because, one, he put English into writing, even though he knew Latin and he knew French. He actually makes fun of people's French in his writing, because he thinks that a lot of English people speak French poorly. But his name is Chaucer. It's obviously he's descended from Normans. Is it chausseur, or is it somebody who makes clothing of some sort? I'm not sure. I don't think we know exactly. But he's a Norman. He's an Anglo-Norman. His father has a government position, and he grows up not as a wealthy aristocrat, but as a sort of civil servant who's connected to the government. He paints a picture of medieval life, talks about priests, talks about kings, talks about knights. He talks about the priesthood and how people he does a lot of satire. He's known for his alliteration, the repetition of sounds, like the F sound repeating or the L sound repeating in his lines. He obviously is very well respected and was a major influence on Shakespeare, who is considered the greatest English writer of ever, of all time. And Chaucer, he was the biggest influence on the development of Middle English. So we study him and we refer to him. He incorporated a lot of French into the written language of English, which 30% of English is composed of French vocabulary. So he solidified that influence of combination of French vocabulary and English pronunciation, and made English respected and popular. John Wycliffe was a priest who went to Oxford, and he got thrown out of the established priesthood. Essentially, he was a heretic. He had some different ideas. One of them was to sort of possess all the land of the church, which is roughly 30% of the country, because people were poor and suffering, that they shouldn't restrict the ownership of land, and the church shouldn't, be controlled by rich people. people should be able to read the Bible in English. This is a very, very controversial idea at the time. And if you're somebody who is, that we have some students who are Muslim, you know, the Muslim Bible, the Quran, it has to be in Arabic. It can't, translating it into other languages is almost like a sin. It's so the same thing is true with the Bible. Originally, it was only in Latin, and you could only read it in Latin and study it in Latin, and changing it into English or German or French was not allowed. This served a lot of, I mean, there is a reason for that, because it's translation changes things. You understand them differently, so you need to study as close to the original as you can. However, the Latin Bible wasn't the original text. The original text was a collection of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and the translation of the Bible, what was called the Vulgate, was in Latin. So that's not the original Bible, but that's the official Bible of the Catholic Church. So Wycliffe tried to start a revolution, essentially. The group of people that followed him were called Lollards, and they were sort of accused of being less intelligent, less accurate, destroying the chain of being, right? He sort of, Wycliffe wanted everybody to be equal when it comes to religion. When it's studying the Bible, everybody has a chance to read it for themselves and understand it. It's an idea that would not really get a lot of traction until the 16th century, 150 years later. But he's way ahead of his time, and you can read about him in the textbook at the end of chapter 2, on page 78. Chaucer's section is just ahead of that. The last event of the 14th century that's significant is the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, and this is when Wycliffe and Chaucer were adults and they were active. The Peasants' Revolt was a reaction to the rich people suppressing what would become known as the Golden Age of Labor. Going into the 15th century, there was less people, therefore the people who were working got higher wages. They got more money, and they could actually own their own land. They didn't have to settle for, working for a landlord and doing whatever the rich people said. So the three main things is, in the Peasants' Revolt, they didn't want to be taxed. They didn't want to fight the war in France, and they didn't want to be taxed. They wanted to be able to move freely from one piece of land to the other, and they wanted wages to be sort of like a free market. You pay for the labor, whatever you can ask for is what you can get, right? This sort of capitalist almost idea where the less people, the higher the demand, the lower the supply, the more costly something is. It's a very sort of open-minded concept. The whole idea of economic change was something that nobody knew. They thought that the problems were related to people's effort, like people were lazy or people were working hard. That's what caused you to be paid more or less. Nobody had any sense of how modern economics work. It's like, if there's an oversupply of teachers, then you don't have to pay the teachers as much. If there's not enough teachers, you have to pay them more. That's just the way the market works. They didn't understand that, and inflation was not a thing. Prices were fixed, and they were set by groups, organized groups called guilds, and so all of the system sort of collapsed under the pressure of the Black Death. So that's sort of the breaking of the chain of being, where everything is organized and controlled, and then all of a sudden 1 in 3 people disappear, and this completely disrupts the order of things. So the peasants, they're led by a man named Wat Tyler. He's probably a roof tiler. He's a tradesman. He probably fought in France. We don't know very much about him, but he led thousands of peasants from Kent in a march towards London. Their object was to kill the officials of the king, burn down the palaces that were funded by wars with France and by their taxes, and destroy all the documents of debt and servitude in order to free themselves from obligations they had to their lords. So that's also in the book. The Consequences of the Black Death on page 79, you can read about what Wat Tyler did. He ends up confronting the king, who is only an elementary school student, about 10 years old. They have a face-to-face meeting. The mayor of London ends up, for some reason, we're not sure exactly the reason, he ends up killing Wat Tyler by stabbing him. And once Wat Tyler is dead, he was the leader of the rebellion. The peasants are confused about what to do, so they sort of just run away. And the whole revolution collapses. That's why it's called a revolt instead of a revolution, because it never gets completed, the whole process. However, after punishing the people who were the leaders, King Richard II, who is not very popular and grows up to end up being, one of those kings that gets replaced by probably by being murdered by his successor. Richard II has a famous moment where he punishes everybody and says, like, you were poor and you will still be poor, and in the future that's what you will be. However, that's not actually what happens. As much as British culture is a kind of conservative culture, there's also this element of sort of compromise that happens. This is the evolution part, where the British elite recognize that they can't keep going the way they're going, so they compromise a little bit. They allow the wages to increase. They allow serfdom is eradicated, so people can move from one piece of land to another. And this ends up creating not a middle class, but a wealthy sort of section of the population that actually owns their own land and has their own farms, which is almost unique in medieval history. And this is, although the 15th century and the 14th century are disastrous for England, they lose all their territory in France. William the Conqueror and Henry II would be rolling over in their graves. Richard, all of that land. John loses everything. Edward III takes most of it back. Henry V almost takes over France, but in the end, in 1453, there's nothing left. The English are kicked out of France completely, and the kingdom is sort of destabilized by the War of the Roses, by the Civil War. So the end of the 100 Years' War is a military disaster and a political disaster. In the end, the War of the Roses will end with Henry VII sort of calming things down and making England, a solid state again. And we'll talk about going into the 16th century, how things change. That's going to be in chapter 3. That's when Elizabeth and Shakespeare and Henry VIII and Thomas More and all these other famous people come along, when England really sort of finds its footing as a nation state and starts to build towards being an empire. But the 14th and 15th century, from the outside, look like serious problems in English society. So that's why the 14th century, I call it the tumultuous century, which means the up and down century. And the 15th century is, at the beginning, they have some kind of a comeback in France, but ultimately lose everything. So it takes several hundred years for the country to recover. But in the meantime, there is a sort of class of landed small farmers that start to exist, and they end up having an influence on governments. They end up having influence on the king, which continues the process of the Magna Carta, making the king respond to the people's will. And like this is the legacy, I think, the most important legacy of the medieval period for England, is that modern democracies and constitutional monarchies, or whatever republic systems that are genuinely responsive to the people and the will of the population, they have their roots. Many of them, even countries like Vietnam, imitate the American Constitution and the American Declaration of Independence. And the American Declaration of Independence goes back to the English Civil War. The English Civil War goes back to the yeomen having power, and the English yeomen having power goes back to Magna Carta. That's sort of one version of history. But in terms of cultural influence, I think that is something you have to consider, is that the English people increasingly had more influence over their king, more so than any other country or kingdom in its time. So that's it for chapter 2. Good luck on the test on Friday. Remember, the things that I write on the board generally are very important things, so make sure that you know the main points related to what I write on the board, and then you should be fine on the quiz. Thank you for listening, and see you on Friday.